President candidate for Bragg. And they gave away a rotary telephone that year to the young AFCEA of the year. So we've been around for a while and love the scholarships and everything this organization does. So it's a real honor for me to be invited to talk to you today about something I'm extremely passionate about. After spending 30 years in the government, watching the networks grow, doing things, having positions from everything from pulling cables and adits to system administration to being an executive for the government, making policy decisions. It was a wonderful career and I really love it and hopefully I have some things to share with you today. I'm going to open our talk, and hopefully that's what it'll be, and some of your questions will allow us to have a little bit of a conversation later, with a brief video that I found a long time ago. Somebody that I worked with created it for a different environment, and I've used it several times. And what I'd like for it to do is just to have you think about change. So the title of the video, if you've ever seen it before, or presentation, is called Shift Happens. And it's about the exponential growth in the environment in which we live in. And there may be a quiz after, because there are some of the things that are in this brief video that will kind of set the stage for growth and some of the things I want to talk to you about that don't exist anymore. They've just been overrun by the growth because the change has been so fast and things that we thought would be here forever aren't. So if you want to cue the video. So thank you for your patience. The reason I picked that is because every single one of those predictions in the last 10 years have absolutely come true. MySpace no longer exists. The Google statistic that was 2.7 billion searches a month is now 2.7 billion searches a day. And it just continues to grow and grow and grow. And as we're talking about cyber, especially in our environment where we're doing the military, we're talking about infrastructure, we're growing quickly. We in the Department of Defense, I've been gone almost 2 years and I'm still waiting. The Department of Defense moves too slow, and we in industry don't help them move fast enough. And so that's kind of where I'd like to focus my thoughts this morning. So infrastructure is foundational to cyber. As you design the tape, what we can do with fiber optics, how much fiber optics are there. There was a huge build out in the early 2000s where fiber was cheap. People put it in the ground. They didn't even always light it up. They just put it there. And the boxes grow and they change and they get more sophisticated. And when we talk about cyber, 99 times out of 100, we talk about layer 3 and above in the ISO model. We're not talking about what we need to do in the infrastructure to protect the infrastructure. And I'm not even talking critical infrastructure protection. That's a whole other topic about bridges and cables and towers, and we could spend weeks on that. But what we have done as a culture, which is why I think the infrastructure is an important piece, other than the fact I'm just passionate about getting it right, is that we as a culture have designed and built our networks to protect our information and our data since we started building networks. We never built the networks to be optimal from a network perspective. We built the networks to protect things in our environment. With growth and change, as much as we've got going on here, we no longer have that luxury. We've got to build the network so the network grows. It shifts dynamically. It does what it needs to do for performance, and we need to bake our security solutions in other ways and in other places. The human factor becomes extremely important, and I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. The growth is just, it's exponential. I can't even imagine how we do what we do today when we used to do it with paper. We just didn't have that much information. Sure. One of the things that I see going on right now is everybody here's probably heard of the Joint Regional Security nodes and the hubs that are going in. And they're being lit up all over the world, which is very important to the department. But all it does is it shifts where we do security from at the enclave to a broader place at the edge. So it's a great first step, but we need to continue to take it further. We can't let things like JRSS, VPN stay. It really is how do you get the systems to take care of themselves, watch themselves. We were talking about the banking industry at breakfast. There are applications out there and have been for a very long time. If I go to use my credit card somewhere where the bank thinks I shouldn't be, or doing something that is just so out of character for me, they either call or they put a hold on my credit card until I call them. Doesn't mean they did anything to my credit, they didn't hurt me, they didn't, but they prevented me from doing something until we had a human interaction to make sure it was the correct thing. So they have software applications out there to watch and to manage and watch what you do so that you can make good decisions, do what you want to do, but be more secure when you do it so that you don't go bankrupt if the bank doesn't do that. We need to move away from, and you've heard this a couple times this week, from a compliance-based security system for everything from the fiber to the top layers of the stack. We've had some really interesting things on the infrastructure side that have really proven why that's important, that we cannot just be compliance-based. We have to be risk management-based. We have to think about what we're doing. And this AOR is probably about 10 years ago now. Massive earthquake off the coast of Japan took out many of the undersea cables that existed in the Sea of Japan and other places. What we found was that the carriers had built their networks and were resilient enough, and the department was able to benefit from that. We found that while the bandwidth was seriously degraded, and it was, we went from huge pipes to little pipes, the networks were resilient enough where no one was denied service, even though I think the commercial industry lost 80–90% of the capacity in the region. Nobody lost communications totally. They were asked to downsize to rebuild, while the commercial carriers and the government rebuilt their network. The only people who lost service were people who had put, I'll call them security practices, but point-to-point circuits, different VPNs, GRE tunnels, something that couldn't be rerouted in the network. Those people lost service. Now, some people, if you were in a building, then we couldn't get to the building, but the infrastructure parts. And that was always very telling to me because people needed to still continue to communicate, and they did. Command and control was never broken. A lot of the MWR stuff got pushed off the network because it wasn't mission critical. But the networks were resilient. They were secure. We didn't have to reroute through really strange places. We were able to just downsize, minimize, and it was less than a week before the carriers had most of that bandwidth back in place through other means to make that all happen. And it was just as secure when we let the carriers and the network do their job as when we tried to manipulate it and gerrymander it to be more secure. We don't do enough of that. We do it in crisis, but we don't do it in our day-to-day engineering. And I truly believe that as we get more into mobility, FaceTime, video that happens, all of the things and the applications that we're moving towards, we're not going to have the luxury of making the network be our security blanket anymore. One of the things, I was at a dinner in Washington a month or so ago, and we were talking about security and the networks and cyber. And one of the things that came up, because it was right in the middle of the Pokemon Go craze, was we're talking to a young woman, industry security professional, who was addicted to Pokemon Go. She hadn't adjusted any of the security settings until she realized one day that they could get to her banking information because she had an app on her phone that thing, and the Pokemon Go was there. But most people didn't realize that everything you had in your phone was being monitored by the game. And for a lot of people, that's okay. But you have to make a conscious choice what you're doing in your environment with things as fundamental as infrastructure. Now, I just referred to that application as infrastructure because anything that can be a sensor and take all the information that you've got to provide technically is part of your infrastructure. It's an application, but it's in your infrastructure because it touches it. Voice and video are the same thing. We used to run separate voice telephony, rotary dial telephones. We don't even do that anymore now. It's just an application on your phone that you don't even really need to be on the phone network to do because you can do it across your cable system and catch a cellular tower somewhere else. So that application, because it's manipulating the infrastructure, needs to be protected at the same level that you're protecting your infrastructure. Audit tools are really important in this environment because if you don't know what's going on, you can't possibly be able to manage it, understand it, change it, protect it. And so one of the things I hear a lot in my activities and travels is that audit's too hard, it's too expensive. There's nothing that takes all of the massive amounts of data that come in through a traditional audit tool and let you understand it. And I would argue that that's true unless you, the person, understand your mission and you understand what you're looking at, what would be anomalous behavior for the network or the application or whatever your mission is, and how you would want to react and respond to that. Maybe you just, like in the banking and the credit card, there are certain things that you look for based on your mission. And your mission at Paycom, you may be looking at something very different than First Signal Brigade is looking at on Penn in Korea, or than the Army is looking at Fort Huachuca. CONUS may be different than Korea, may be different than here, but if you understand the mission and you're not trying to do a one-size-fits-all set of data reduction, you should be able to figure out a tool or a way to do that works for you. So really, I think where I'm trying to push you is that there's a whole human element to cyber and network security, and we've heard a little bit about this, but I think it becomes more and more important as you mature your networks, as things grow, as things change so fast that you don't even know where you're going to be a year from now. Yeah, how do you get people to think about security differently, privacy differently, management differently? My husband and I just recently built a house, and for those of you who I've told this story to, I apologize. But we built a smart house, so we are actually part of the Internet of Things. I have a whole IP block that's assigned to my house, and I have a 19-inch rack in the basement. It's just really very sad. But the guy who designed that for me was very angry with me. The only problem we had building this house, so most people who build a custom house, you're mad about the architect, you're mad about this, you're mad about something else. We argued with the network guy because I wanted a network that was somewhat secure, and I know there's risks anytime you touch the internet. Has anybody seen the Big Bang Theory show where the guys are in China are driving the remote control cars around the apartment and turning the lights on and off, and the scientists are very excited because they can go on the internet and do that? Technically, you can do all those things. We found that show really fascinating and funny, but it also went to the reaffirmation that that wasn't what we wanted in our house, not that we have remote control cars. But I didn't want somebody to be able to turn my lights on and off, or my heat up or down, or my water. So I can control my water from my iPad for my faucets outside. If I need to shut the water off, I just touch my iPad and it does it. So the restriction that we wanted to put in our house was that the only place you could do those things was if you came in on a wireless, you came in wirelessly in the house. So we wanted port security on everything that went to the internet. My network guy didn't want to do that. Now, Admiral Mackey and I were talking about this the other day, and I hadn't thought about this when we were building the house. He may not have known how to do that. So we asked him for something that he wasn't comfortable doing, and so he didn't do it, so I found somebody else to do it. But our house is as secure as I can make it and still have all the fun features of the Internet of Things. We still look at it all the time. The hack that happened, I guess it's about 2 weeks ago now, but the DDoS attack that affected the internet, that was done through home security cameras. So somebody with a house just like mine, I have 4 cameras. I can look at the mountain lion as he walks across the earth. I have 4 cameras outside the house. They're all password protected. And this same person wanted to leave the default password on all 4 of those. So I can actually tell you my house was not one of the ones that they used the security cameras to get into the network. But a lot of people don't know or don't think to ask those questions. The human factor is really important. You have to decide where you want to take your risk. And so we decided anything on property, you could change it. So if I'm right in my house and you change my security cameras, shame on me. If you're coming in from the internet and I let you get into my house to do that from the internet, shame on you. So we gotta figure out how to do that better. And we gotta figure out how to how to make sure that that's done. So there's a certain amount of going back and verifying. So patches, I've heard a lot about patches this week. And some people think patching is really good, and some people think patching is too cumbersome and too hard. I would argue that even if it takes you a long time to go through the test process, you still need to patch. Because there will be some denial of service attack, and we've seen this in the department many, many times, that somebody will find something 5 years later that we thought we blocked 5 years ago, but if somebody didn't patch it, when it comes up again, then everything comes up again. It's like paisley and shirts and mini skirts, it all comes back. How do you stop those things if you're not doing the patching? It is worth the time, it is worth the investment, but in some cases maybe you need industry's help to do that, to get those patches done. There are companies out there in industry who would love to patch and test for people that don't have the time to do it themselves and need to get it done. So all those things are important, but it really gets the personal hygiene and knowing your mission and knowing your network and how you're going to protect it. Because you can, believe me when I tell you the bad guys know your network, the bad guys want to know your mission. And if they're going to invest that much time in figuring out whether it's for criminal activity, financial criminals, the big one that we always used to struggle with because people want to steal stuff. Whether it's industrial espionage, whether it's money, whether it's they want stuff, they want information. And you should know as much about your networks, about your systems, and your applications as the bad guy does, because you can't possibly protect against him. And that's really what we're talking about in cyber, is protecting against the guy from getting what you don't want him to have. So it becomes a how do you manage that? How do you protect that? And we don't always think about it in those ways. It's kind of like a car. Somebody hands you the keys to the car, you start, you drive it. Do you check the oil and the gas? We check the gas typically, but you don't check the air pressure and the oil and stuff before you drive off. If somebody's giving you the key to the car, you assume it's operational if it starts. We do that a lot on the network with computers and phones and stuff. Somebody hands you a device, it works. You go out and you use it. And so we do need to take a little bit of a better look at that. We also need to hold people accountable. One of the reasons I think people don't check things is because we don't hold them accountable. It took this cyber challenge that the students did yesterday afternoon, and actually did okay. I didn't score really, really high, but I only missed a couple. But one of the questions really resonated with me because it was the only one. So one of the questions in the cyber challenge had to do with what was considered a legally considered a computer compromise or computer theft, intellectual property theft. And so I will share the answer to part of it with you. Is the one question that never even occurred to me that it wasn't considered computer crime was pornography and child pornography on your computer, because that's the only thing as a government employee I was ever able to prosecute someone for. Now, I never had a Snowden or anybody work for me, but people who would just do foolish things, compromise security, send the wrong file, do something. Those things weren't treated nearly as importantly as pornography, and I don't want to minimize that, but of all the questions in there, that's the one that's not considered cybercrime. It's considered criminal for lots of other reasons. It just happens to be on a computer. So when I saw the answer, I was going, okay, well, yeah, that does make sense to me. But in all the years I was trying to get people to do the right thing on the network, pornography is the only one I ever was able to send somebody to jail for. The rest of it was, like getting a warning for a traffic ticket. We've got to hold people accountable. Anytime you do something bad on your computer, there has to be, you speed, you get a ticket. In our new environment in cyber, maybe if we're having poor cyber hygiene, we leave our applications open at night so that we can't get the software patches pushed even though you're patching. Maybe that should be a warning ticket, just that somebody's watching and looking, and how do you do that? Insider threat is probably our biggest problem when we talk to, and it's all about computer hygiene. If people know, just like in the banks, that you're looking, that there's a penalty, and maybe you're suspended from your email for a week, and then you have to come back and clean out 10,000 things because you didn't get to look at it for a week. job. It just has to be held personally accountable for the actions you take in the environment. And I think if we think about that, we'll get there. But we're limited currently by our own policies and processes. We're not agile enough. And the one thing I guess I would encourage the industry folks in here, because the government folks, and I can tell you from being one, you get running so fast, so hard, doing so many things, you don't always see what in industry is very obvious. In industry, we need to provide more thought leadership back to government. Every conversation we have with government can't be about selling a product, changing an environment. The bottom line, there has to be a thought leadership aspect to doing that. Some companies are very good at that, some aren't. Some government people are afraid that every time they take an industry meeting, it's going to become a sales pitch. It's not going to be about thought leadership, so it's tough to have those conversations. But if you're in industry and you see something, we need to figure out how to say something to the government so the government can hear it not as a sales pitch, but as a way to help them improve, help them change, and take this network and the infrastructure and cyber protection to the next layer. That's going to become even more and more important with the allies. I had dinner with an allied partner last night for something that I put in place almost 15 years ago now. It's still the default solution. We haven't modernized it. We absolutely have to. We will never go to war alone again. It will always be with mission partners. It won't just be joint. It will be with foreign countries. And how do we share information and what information and how do we design those things? Sometimes in industry we see those answers, but we don't come in and tell the government because lots of different reasons. I would encourage that conversation to happen. So with that, I'll wrap up and take questions. Yep. So I have plenty of time for questions, and I'm not going to make Admiral Mackey be late. So, do we have questions?
We do. First question is a two-parter. Could you discuss the physical network infrastructure itself as a threat surface or inherent weakness for cybersecurity? And then the second part, what are the greatest legacy weaknesses that need to be fixed?
Okay, so we'll talk to some of that, but not all of that, because when I retired, they took that Men in Black light and erased a part of my brain. So the attack surface is very important, and the more holes you punch in the attack surface, the easier it is for people to get in. There was a really good speaker who talked about that yesterday. What we tend to do is if we don't like the solution, we don't like the time it's coming in, we'll develop our own and we'll punch a hole in the network. Those holes are what really create problems and weaknesses in the network. No matter how good an individual firewall is, if it's on the outside, instead of at a control point, you're going to miss something. You're going to miss, because the audit tools are different, it rolls up differently. You're not going to be able to correlate something that to you doesn't look like an anomaly because somebody came in a different way. I've seen several times where different services, and I won't name names, there are lots of different services and agencies in the department network, where they design things very differently. So we'll just use fair-weighted queuing and the way that the network does quality of service for certain applications. If the Army does it one way and the Air Force does it another way, you null each other out of the edge so nobody's getting quality of service across the enterprise. You get it in your little enclave. But when you use those queuing techniques to do your QoS, you're good until you hit the enterprise, and then the enterprise kills you until you get back into your enclave. And in security, it's the exact same thing. If I deploy it differently and have a different port security than somebody else does, that port security is not going to be as strong as it is if we all implement it the same way. Now, DISA actually has an organization that does the standards, and they publish those standards, and if you're compliant with the standards, then everybody should have those same security measures in place, but the standards are also open to interpretation. So if it's mucking with my application, I don't necessarily implement it exactly the way this is said. I go in for a waiver and exception. Cyber Command is working on that. I think that's going to be a huge improvement to standardizing security for things like port security across the environment, but keeping the attack surface to the internet as small as possible, as well known as possible, and as standard as possible, I think will really help with that. And that gets to the legacy weaknesses. I think, so some of them, so a legacy weakness, and the OPM at PAC is probably a good example. That program is so old that other than the raw data, there was nothing that could be done with that. So many of the systems in the department are really old. Some of them are 20, 25, 30 years old. It's like going out and buying a 386. I mean, you couldn't find one if you wanted to. And I think that's the biggest challenge, is how do we get all of our applications up to the same standard that industry has today? And I'm not just talking virtualizing, I'm talking replacing them. How do you replace some of these legacy applications with things that are self-protecting, that have the heuristics in them to know if you're being bad or good? So I think that's the biggest weakness, is we don't have the investment there in the so it's not so much a network as it is just in the computing infrastructure. There are lots of applications out there that really need to be brought into this century, and it's expensive, and it's rip and replace, because you can't just modify it and move it in. And I don't know that the department today has the funding, the resources, or the time to be able to do that. But I would say that's probably something that really does need to be fixed, and the sooner the better, because it's not in the network layer. We can make a router, a switch, a fiber cable. We can fix those things. That's pretty straightforward. Applications are hard. Next question.
With the rapid change of technology, how should organizations make better investments in training to stay relevant?
So I think they should go back and take a lesson from the past. So I'll tell just a little personal story. So I never wanted to be a computer or a network geeky kind of person. I wanted to be a large animal veterinarian. And that's what I went to school for, took all the pre-med course, did all that, and then I fell in love with this Army guy, and that all went out the window. But when I first started working for the government, they had this thing called Train the Trainer. And they typically sent the civilian to school because the civilian had some stability. So as a civilian, I kept getting sent to school. I worked in an S3 training shop, and they were all military, and I was the only civilian, and I was doing training and education. And so I would be the wind dummy. They would send me off to school, and I would come back and teach people how to do stuff like word process and do different things, because I was going to be there. And so everybody in the organization actually got trained because I was there every day. So once I knew how to do it, I would go and help you learn how to do it. And if you had a question, we'd either call in the industry guy to tell us, or we'd answer it together. And then when the new guy came in, I was still there to do that. Every organization in the Army back then had somebody that was their job, was to do train the trainer stuff, whether it was battalion combat readiness teams, computers, what have you. And I'm sure the Navy was the same way. You had somebody on every ship that was doing that. We don't do that anymore. Now we just bundle people off and send them to school. And school training is important, but you don't have to school train everybody. How do you do the train? NTOC has done that for years up at NSA for what they do for the networks. They train each other. You get the pros from Dover, they go to school, and they come back and teach everybody else. I think some of those older programs would be very helpful to keeping us current and better trained and sharing that expertise around the whole environment. Next one.
Thank you. In the military, where we deploy and operate in austere areas, what are the most significant network weaknesses we need to fix?
So this is a policy question. The network's fine, and the network does some stuff, and there are some neat technologies that we put in place a couple years before I retired that are still there, but they can only be used in U.S. Central Command. So there are solutions deployed in Afghanistan today that would help in Korea today, and PACOM cannot buy them because they're not allowed in this AOR because it was done under a CENTCOM nuance. So that's a policy question. I tried to solve it for 5 years, couldn't do it. And some of those capabilities that we built very specifically for Afghanistan because of the mountains, the rugged terrain, would solve lots of these problems in other austere areas, but because there's no conflict, the policy doesn't let the department buy and deploy them there. And so that I guess would be my biggest thing. Now here I would ask industry to help. There are lots of ways to use, so again, a personal story. So in my house, we put a radio network because of where we are and how much concrete is in the walls. A regular 802.11 vendor typical network was, I was going to have 3 times as many access points, which meant more maintenance and more updates and different stuff. By putting a wireless radio network in and running the 802.11 across my radio network, and I'm trying really hard not to be vendor specific, but the guys who own that company are here today, and thank you very much. I love your technology. It works great. It doesn't go down. The radio stuff is fantastic, and I only have to have 1 network point other than where the regular, I only have to retransmit it once instead of 6 times. So it's a better network, the handoffs are cleaner, it works better. We need to bring more things like that into the environment instead of just the same old, same old. What works in Garrison does not always work in the field. We really struggled when industry end of life, the layer 2 CDMA networks, because we had deployed a bunch of that stuff to overseas allies and partners. And we couldn't figure out for a while how to get them in the IP world, and we finally did, and we provided that and replaced those devices. But industry helped us do that. It wasn't just that the government woke up one day and had a Gatorade and figured out how to do it. We worked with industry, we played around with some stuff, we got the right things out there. So I think it's really how you think about the network. The Garrison network doesn't work in the field, you're correct. Applications need to be sized for the austere environment. Maybe if I'm BTCing, it becomes like my FaceTime on my phone where I don't get the video if I don't have the bandwidth, but I still keep the audio. There are applications to do that. So I don't think it's the network as much as the way we deploy it, and that we use things globally everywhere we can use them instead of restricting them to a combatant commander. Next question.
What do you think is the greatest risk to the average user of mobile technology?
So that's a tough one. I mean, there are technical answers from a security side. GPS is a challenge. It's not a problem, it's a challenge, because so many of the applications and things the user wants require the GPS technology. But from a security perspective, that's not a technology that you really want carrying around in your pocket. So how do you manage that so you can turn the GPS on when you want to do, because back to people again, turn the GPS on when you want to use the application that you're interested in using, and you turn it off again when you're done. You can still find people, you can do stuff, but it reduces that particular attack vector because it's not on all the time. But you have to rely on the person to turn it off and on, not just leave it on. The other thing is, and I, as I said, I never wanted to be a technologist, it just happened. I was getting ready to travel last April. My iPhone, 6 hours before the plane, died. I mean, it just died. And Apple can't even figure out what, I took it in and they can't figure out what happened to it. But I walked into a store because my whole business is now run on that product. My office phone is there. I mean, I have other tools, but here I am getting ready to get on an airplane and I got nothing. And I'm scheduling meetings and doing stuff. I literally walked into the phone store and said, what do you have in stock? I need to walk out of here in 30 minutes with a phone with all my stuff moved out of the cloud back onto my phone. I think that's the biggest concern, is that we become so dependent on them that when you lose it, I never realized how dependent I was on it. Like, didn't have it. And I don't even like it, and I didn't have it. So figuring out what that balance is and how you archive your data and you make sure you can recover. I was lucky, I had everything in the cloud, so once they sold me the phone, we could move it back down. But not everybody does that. Some people don't like that, and there's a risk there too as to what data you've got. But I think it really becomes about data management in this environment, because you can lose everything if you don't have it backed up. And you can lose everything depending on what all you've got in there, and you back it up and somebody steals it. So it's that, I think, is the biggest risk, is how do you manage that data when you're not using it so you've always got it. Are there more? Yep.
Are there any elements of network security that we need to consider as we use space in the space systems?
Yep, they're the exact same ones we use for terrestrial. The only difference is when you design an encryptor, it's got to have some different timing and things so it doesn't time out, but we still need to encrypt it. And we need to encrypt it, and when I say encrypt it, it doesn't need to necessarily be type 1 if it's not your application, but we encrypt everything. Again, back to the iPhone and the cellular thing. Every time you click on your computer to do SSH, or you got that little lock down there, the data is encrypted in transit. It may not be encrypted when you look at it, but when you're moving it around, there's some kind of commercial encryption there. So I don't think it's any different. And as we get more and more routers in space and telephony in space and those things, they need to be protected to the exact same level as the network is on the base station. The others?
We have about 3 more.
I think we have time.
We do.
Perfect.
What do you see as the biggest challenges facing DoD, cyber, IT, and communications arenas in the next 5 years?
So short term, I think because we have done this whole pivot to cyber, which is really important, I think the defense side, the operating defense side, is going to struggle a little bit when they should be lockstep together, in my personal opinion. The cyber part's really important, but I would be willing to bet you that if I sat down with a cyber guy today, who was in that new cyber, and we were starting to talk about the infrastructure. So we'll say undersea fiber optic cables. There was a chart that yesterday's breakfast speaker put up that had the DRAN network on it globally that made me ill, because I saw where some things were connected that I was surprised they were connected there. But I would be willing to bet you that they couldn't track down by cable system what was where. They know what's running at layer 3 and above in the applications and how to see those anomalies and where people normally live. But when you get down into those bottom layers, they don't understand the infrastructure as well as they need to be able to understand the second and third order impacts and effects of what they're doing. Which gets to one of the talks yesterday. I may choose to take out part of the net, so say Guam or impact. So I may choose to isolate Guam because there's a cyber event going on in Guam that is a problem for me. And I'm not going to let it get to the rest of the network. I'm going to take out Guam because until I can get it cleaned up, that's an important place for me. From an infrastructure perspective, from a network service provider, Guam's a hub for me. And without going into details, if somebody isolates Guam from the rest of the network, I've messed up a bunch of stuff. So by denying an application attack, I may have messed up a bunch of other stuff unintentionally because I didn't realize how critical Guam was to some other application or even industry. Because if the DoD does something and gets industry to cooperate, you may accidentally bump somebody else off. And so a decision that makes perfect sense to one guy may be devastating to the other guy because they're not having that cross-pollination. I think of it kind of like the reason that everybody sits in the KOC together if you're in the Air Force and you're doing it, it stops the blue on blue stuff. You gotta have those guys sitting together, talking to each other. It's not separate. The network has to be part of cyber, which is kind of where we started. Cyber isn't cyber without the network. And if you don't understand what all's there and what the second and third order effects of what you're doing are, the risk is pretty high.
How do you hold businesses such as banking, other commerce, and state and local government employees accountable for management of sensitive information to the same or similar degree to the federal government?
So an analogy I'll use, and I've used this one before, it's no different than a driver's license. If I have a driver's license in Colorado, I can drive in Virginia because there's a state or there's a federal standard that I have to maintain and meet to get that driver's license. If I don't have a driver's license, then it's a different penalty. But there's just a certain amount of hygiene. We should be teaching our kids how to manage stuff and take care of themselves in their network and their environment from the time we hand them that computer, whether it's as a toddler with a game or growing up through school. It has to be inherent in what you do. They're not immigrants like I am to the network. they're growing up with this technology, they trust it, they know it, they don't. I mean, that's like I grew up driving a stick shift car. Many people today don't even know how to do that because they're not trained. So it's how do you get in the education cycle from the beginning, and then you hold people accountable. And if it's an honest mistake, people make mistakes. And again, I get back to Carter's driver's licenses. Every once in a while, you're gonna have an accident. But there's a difference between having an accident that's truly an accident and being a drunk driver or whatever, and the penalties are different for that. Honest accidents are treated differently, and we need to really get serious about cyber. If somebody gets hurt because of something you do, you should be held accountable for it. You could make everybody get, I think I did hear that this week, that everybody should get a national ID card and be kind of monitored and managed. I kind of have one. My military ID card still does that for me. I look at it, I'm still in the system. Most of us here are, and we're comfortable with that, but regular people aren't. So we just need to figure out how to get there. Next one.
Ma'am, you answered the next question in your response to this one. So, ladies and gentlemen, can you please welcome Jim Muller, President of AFCEA Hawaii, to the stage to thank Ms. Moran?
Hello everyone. Thank you, Ms. Moran. On behalf of AFCEA International and AFCEA Hawaii, I would like to present you with this directive.
I can't even speak.
About really next door.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, thank you, Ms. Moran. Today, we are joined by tomorrow's leaders, their cadre, who are part of the junior ROTC programs from across the great state of Hawaii. Please stand as you hear your school's name called and remain standing. Farrington High School, Kalaheo High School, Lelehua High School, McKinley High School,